an arrogant millionaire who likes to humiliate his employees. One day he humiliated a lady who had worked at the house for years. But what happened next will surprise you. The grand chandelier shimmered above the opulent ballroom, casting a warm golden glow over the lavish gathering. Guests adorned in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled, their laughter ringing through Robert Sinclair's mansion like a symphony of wealth and privilege. Robert, standing tall at the center of the room, exuded an air of arrogance that seemed to fill the space around him. With a glass of expensive champagne in hand, he regaled his companions with stories of his latest business triumphs, his voice booming as he emphasized the vastness of his fortune. "Just last week, I secured a deal worth millions," Robert declared, his lips curling into a self-satisfied smirk. "It's all about knowing the right people and keeping them in line. You see, success is not just a stroke of luck. It's a carefully orchestrated game." His audience nodded, captivated by his bravado. But just beyond their circle, a different scene unfolded. Agnes, the elderly housekeeper who had devoted over 20 years of her life to the Sinclair family, stood in the shadows of the bustling hall. Her frail figure, draped in a simple black dress, contrasted sharply with the glimmering extravagance that surrounded her. She had seen countless parties like this, each marked by the same ostentation, and Robert's inherent disdain for anyone who fell beneath his gilded status. Her heart ached as she watched him boast, recalling the days when he was a kind boy, full of dreams and laughter, before ambition twisted him into the man he had become. "Look at him," Agnes muttered softly to herself, shaking her head. "He forgets that it's the people behind the scenes who keep this all running smoothly." The bitterness of her thoughts clashed with the fond memories she held close. As if on cue, a young waiter stumbled, accidentally spilling a tray of cocktails across the polished marble floor. Gasps erupted from the crowd, and Robert's laughter cut through the air like a knife. "Are you really that incompetent?" he barked, his voice laced with contempt. "What kind of service is this? Get it together, or you'll find yourself out on the street." Agnes felt a surge of anger rise within her, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. The waiter, a boy no older than 20, stood frozen, humiliation washing over him as Robert's eyes bore into him like a predator, sizing up its prey. "I'm sorry, sir. It was an accident," the young man stammered, his face flushed with shame. "An accident?" Robert scoffed, dismissing the apology with a wave of his hand. "You think I care about your little mistakes? You're lucky to even be here. Show some respect for the job you have." Agnes couldn't bear to witness the cruelty any longer. She stepped forward, her voice steady but low. "Mr. Sinclair, that's enough. He's just a boy trying to do his best." Robert turned to her, surprise flashing across his face, quickly replaced by irritation. "And who asked you, Agnes? You should be seen, not heard. Know your place." The weight of his words struck her like a physical blow, and she retreated into the shadows, her heart heavy with pity for the young waiter. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him that he was not alone in this moment of humiliation, but the fear of Robert's wrath kept her silent. As the party continued, Robert strolled through the crowd, oblivious to the murmurs of his staff. 2 employees huddled in a corner, their voices barely above a whisper. "Did you hear about the last round of layoffs? I'm terrified I'll be next," one of them confided, glancing nervously around. "Same here," the other replied, anxiety etched on her face. "Robert's been in a mood lately. He's unpredictable." Robert, ever the narcissist, caught snippets of their conversation, a sardonic smirk creeping across his face. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, reveling in their fear as if it were a badge of honor. Good, he thought to himself. Let them worry. They'll work harder when they know their jobs are on the line. He took a sip of his champagne, the bubbles tickling his nose, and dismissed their concerns as he returned to his guests, ready to regale them with tales of his success once more. The laughter and music enveloped him, a cocoon of self-satisfaction, while Agnes stood alone in the dimly lit corner, torn between loyalty and the dawning realization that her time in this gilded cage was drawing to a close. The morning sun filtered through the grand windows of Robert Sinclair's mansion, casting an opulent glow on the polished marble floors. However, the beauty of the day did little to lift Robert's sour mood. He paced in his sprawling kitchen, where the scent of burnt toast lingered in the air, remnants of a rushed breakfast. His eyes narrowed as they landed on Agnes, the elderly housekeeper who had devoted over 2 decades to his family. "What the hell is this?" Robert barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Agnes, her silver hair tied back neatly, turned to face him, her hands clasped together in front of her apron. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sinclair. I'll make a fresh batch right away," she replied, her voice steady, despite the tension in the room. "Sorry? You think sorry will fix the fact that I had to choke down that disaster? I pay you to make my mornings pleasant, not a culinary nightmare," Robert snapped, his frustration boiling over from a failed business deal that had soured the day. Agnes kept her gaze steady, a flicker of hurt crossing her features. "I've served your family for 20 years, Robert. I've always prepared breakfast with care. Perhaps there was a mistake, but it's not worth— Not worth what? Your job? Because that's exactly what it is," he interrupted, his voice rising. "Now, hold on just a minute." Agnes took a step forward, her heart pounding. "I've given my life to this household. I've seen you grow up. I've taken care of your mother. You can't just dismiss me over a burnt piece of toast." Robert's expression hardened. "You're in no position to lecture me, Agnes. I'm done listening to your excuses. You're fired." The words hung in the air like a heavy shroud, freezing Agnes in place. She felt a well of emotions threatening to spill over: anger, sadness, disbelief. Fired? After all these years? Her voice trembled slightly, but she fought to maintain her composure. "Effective immediately. Pack your things and leave," Robert said coldly, turning away from her as if dismissing a mere inconvenience. "Robert, please," she pleaded, her voice softer now. "You're making a mistake. You know my dedication. I've cared for you and your family when no one else would. I deserve more respect than this." Robert turned back, his expression unyielding. "Respect? You think that's what this is about? Respect is earned, not given, and right now, you're just a liability I can't afford." Agnes swallowed hard, the tears welling in her eyes threatening to spill. "You may not see it, but I have a secret that could change everything. Save it, Agnes. I don't want to hear your sob story." He waved his hand dismissively, already regretting that he had even engaged in this conversation. "Just listen to me," she implored, desperation creeping into her tone. "You don't know what I've sacrificed for your family." But Robert had already turned away, his back rigid, his mind made up. He strode toward the door, leaving Agnes standing in the middle of the kitchen, her heart aching with the weight of his rejection. As she gathered her few belongings from the small room that had been her sanctuary for so long, Agnes felt a deep sense of loss wash over her. The kitchen, once filled with the laughter and love of the Sinclair family, now felt hollow. She poured her memories into a small bag, each item a reminder of the life she had built within these walls. With one last glance at the mansion that had been her home, she stepped outside, the cool air hitting her like a wave. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she walked away, feeling the weight of betrayal heavy on her heart. Inside, Robert stood by the window, watching her go. A flicker of doubt crept into his mind, but he quickly pushed it aside. He was the master of his domain, and he would not let sentimentality cloud his judgment. Yet, as the door clicked shut behind Agnes, a sense of emptiness began to settle in the pit of his stomach, a premonition of the turmoil that lay ahead. Days passed since Robert Sinclair had dismissed Agnes, the elderly housekeeper whose dedication had been a constant in his life. The grand mansion felt different. Now, the polished floors echoed with an unsettling emptiness, and the vibrant warmth that Agnes brought into the household was sorely missed. Each morning, as he sipped his coffee in the vast dining room, Robert felt a strange void creeping in, gnawing at him softly. His thoughts often drifted to the woman he had cast aside so callously, and for the first time, he found himself reflecting on her unwavering loyalty. "Why am I thinking about her?" he muttered to himself one afternoon, staring blankly at a stack of paperwork. The hustle and bustle of his life felt unbearably hollow without Agnes's gentle presence. She had been more than just a housekeeper. She had been a fixture of comfort, a living reminder of family and care within these walls. Robert dismissed the thought as weakness, but the nagging sensation refused to leave him. One rainy evening, seeking solace from the storm outside, Robert wandered into the attic. It was a place he rarely visited, filled with dust-covered boxes and forgotten memories. As he rummaged through the clutter, he stumbled upon an old wooden chest. Intrigued, he opened it to find a collection of family photographs. He sifted through the faded images, each telling stories of laughter, milestones, and cherished moments. Then, one photograph stopped him cold. There in the sepia-toned picture stood Agnes, radiant and youthful, alongside his late mother at a garden party. The two women were laughing, their eyes sparkling with joy. Robert felt a jolt of confusion. "What is this?" he whispered, furrowing his brow. He had never seen this image before, nor had he ever considered a connection between Agnes and his mother. It was as if a hidden thread had been unearthed, binding their lives in ways he had yet to comprehend. Baffled, he studied the photograph again. Was there something deeper to Agnes's presence in their lives? He recalled snippets of conversations where Agnes had mentioned working for his mother before he was born, but it had always seemed like mere nostalgia. Now it felt like a key to a door he had never thought to open. Driven by an unfamiliar sense of urgency, Robert decided he needed to uncover the truth. He grabbed his phone and began scrolling through his mother's old contacts, searching for friends who might hold answers. He dialed the number of Mrs. Thompson, a woman who had been a close companion to his mother in her later years. "Hello?" a voice chirped on the other end. "Mrs. Thompson, it's Robert Sinclair," he said, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. "Oh, Robert, what a lovely surprise," she replied warmly. "What can I do for you?" "I'm looking for some information about Agnes," he admitted, his heart racing. "I found a photograph of her with my mother, and I was hoping you could tell me more about their relationship." There was a pause on the other end, a silence that felt heavy with unspoken words. "Ah, Agnes," Mrs. Thompson finally said, her tone shifting to a more serious note. "She was more than just a housekeeper. Your mother and Agnes were very close." "Close?" Robert echoed, his mind racing. "In what way?" "Let's just say Agnes played a significant role during a challenging time in your mother's life," Mrs. Thompson said carefully. "She was there when your mother needed support the most. There was a bond that went beyond mere employment. Agnes was family, in a sense. Robert's heart thudded in his chest. Family? How had he never known this? Is there anything else? Any specific stories? He pressed, desperate for clarity. Mrs. Thompson hesitated. You should speak to Agnes yourself. She deserves that. But remember, Robert, family ties can be complex and hidden for a reason. Be prepared for what you might learn. As he hung up the phone, Robert felt a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, regret, and a haunting sense of impending revelation. The pieces of a long-buried puzzle were slowly coming together, and he was beginning to realize that his actions had consequences far beyond what he had ever imagined. With determination, he set out to piece together Agnes's past, unaware of the shocking truth that lay ahead, waiting to redefine everything he thought he knew about his family and himself. Robert Sinclair stepped into the dimly lit nursing home, a place that reeked of antiseptic and nostalgia. The walls were adorned with framed photographs of times gone by, each image telling a story of lives once vibrant. He felt out of place, a stark contrast to the warm, inviting atmosphere that surrounded him. As he approached the reception desk, the nurse looked up at him with curiosity, her expression a mix of professionalism and pity. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice kind but cautious. "I'm looking for anyone who might know Agnes," he replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Agnes Mitchell. She worked for my family for years." The nurse's expression softened at the mention of Agnes's name. "Oh, Agnes. She's indeed a beloved figure here. You might want to speak with Mrs. Collins. She's been friends with Agnes for decades." With a nod of gratitude, Robert made his way down the corridor, passing rooms filled with residents engaged in various activities. Some were playing cards, others were knitting, and a few were lost in the pages of well-worn books. He felt a pang of guilt as he recalled how he had treated Agnes, how easily he had dismissed her life and contributions. When he finally reached Mrs. Collins' room, he knocked lightly on the door. "Mrs. Collins, it's Robert Sinclair. May I come in?" "Of course, dear," came a frail voice from inside. As he opened the door, Robert was struck by the sight of the elderly woman sitting in a chair by the window, bathed in soft sunlight. She looked up at him with bright eyes, her face etched with the lines of time and experience. "Mr. Sinclair, what a surprise!" she exclaimed, a smile spreading across her face. "What brings you here?" "I need to know about Agnes," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "I've come to understand how much she means to my family, and I want to learn more about her." Mrs. Collins's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of understanding. Agnes was a remarkable woman. She was a part of our social circle long before she became your housekeeper. Always so generous, so kind. Did you know she once organized charity events for the community? Robert shook his head, shame washing over him like a cold wave. "I didn't know any of this." "During a particularly difficult time for your mother, Agnes sacrificed so much. She gave up her own dreams to support her," Mrs. Collins continued, her voice softening as she reminisced. "Your mother was struggling, and Agnes stepped in without hesitation. She was like a sister to her." The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Robert felt as if he were standing on the precipice of a great abyss, staring into the depths of his own ignorance. "What happened to her dreams?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She always wanted to be an artist," Mrs. Collins revealed, her eyes misting over with memories. "But life had other plans. She dedicated herself to your family and never looked back." Robert's heart sank further as he absorbed the truth of Agnes's sacrifices. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. He had squandered the opportunity to appreciate a woman who had given everything for those she loved. "Is she happy here?" he inquired, his voice laced with concern. "She makes the best of it, as she always has," Mrs. Collins replied, a hint of sadness creeping into her tone. "But I know she misses your family. She often speaks fondly of her time with you all." A surge of regret coursed through Robert. He could see Agnes's face in his mind, the warmth in her eyes, the way she had nurtured him and his family without question. "I need to apologize," he said suddenly, determination igniting within him. "I must make things right." Mrs. Collins regarded him thoughtfully. "It's good that you've come to this realization, Robert. But remember, it's not just about your apology. It's about understanding and respecting her for who she is." "I understand," he replied, his voice firm. "I want to offer her a job back. I want her to know she's valued." As he left the nursing home, Robert's heart raced with a mix of hope and trepidation. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of empathy igniting within him. He envisioned Agnes's face, lighting up with joy, her laughter filling the air, and he realized that the path to redemption was paved with sincerity and action. As he stepped out into the crisp air, Robert Sinclair made a silent vow to restore the bond he had so carelessly severed. Robert Sinclair entered his opulent mansion with a determined stride, the weight of regret heavy on his shoulders. He had spent days reflecting on his actions, the callousness that had cost him the loyalty of Agnes, the housekeeper who had devoted herself to his family for decades. He was resolved to make things right. As he stepped into the grand foyer, however, his eyes fell upon a neatly folded letter resting on the polished mahogany table, the elegant script unmistakable. With a frown, he picked it up, his heart racing as he recognized Agnes's familiar handwriting. Unfolding the letter, he felt a chill run down his spine as he began to read. Each word struck him like a blow. Agnes detailed her struggles since her dismissal, describing how she had been forced to live in a cramped apartment, far from the warmth of his mansion. The letter painted a picture of loneliness and poverty, a stark contrast to the life of luxury Robert had taken for granted. "Dear Mr. Sinclair," it began, "I never imagined I would be writing this letter. Since I left your home, I have found myself in a situation that I never thought I would face. I have always held my head high, but the truth is, I am struggling to make ends meet. I've lost more than just my job. I've lost my sense of purpose and belonging." Robert's hands trembled as he read on. Agnes spoke of her estranged daughter, of missed opportunities and unfulfilled dreams. "I wish I could have been there for her when she needed me most," she wrote. "But the life I led in your service consumed me. I dedicated myself to your family, and in doing so, I lost my own." His heart sank further as he realized the gravity of what he had done. Not only had he dismissed a dedicated employee, but he had also compounded her suffering by severing ties with her family. A wave of guilt washed over him, and he clenched the letter tightly, his knuckles whitening. "I am moving in with my daughter now," Agnes continued, "and though our relationship is strained, I hope that time will heal the wounds. I want you to know that I do not hold any malice towards you. You have your own battles to fight, and I hope you find peace in your endeavors." Tears brimmed in Robert's eyes as he finished reading. He could hardly believe how blind he had been, trapped in his own arrogance and disdain. Determined to find her, he rushed out of the house, his mind racing with thoughts of how to make amends. He needed to find Agnes and apologize, to offer her not just her job back, but also his sincere remorse for the pain he had caused. As he drove through the city, he felt a flicker of hope, intertwined with despair. He knew he had to act quickly. He could not let Agnes slip away from him again. But as he arrived at the address he had found in the letter, a sense of foreboding loomed over him. The building was modest, a stark contrast to the life of luxury he had come from. He parked and hurried towards the entrance, his heart racing with anticipation and dread. He knocked on the door with urgency, his breath hitching as he waited. A moment later, a woman in her 40s opened the door, her expression wary but curious. "Can I help you?" she asked, eyeing him suspiciously. "I'm looking for Agnes," he replied, his voice a mixture of desperation and hope. "Please, is she here?" The woman hesitated, her gaze narrowing as she assessed him. "Who are you?" "I'm Robert Sinclair," he admitted, his heart pounding. "I need to speak with her. It's important." The woman's expression softened slightly, but there was still a guarded look in her eyes. "Agnes? She's been through a lot. I'm not sure if she wants to see anyone right now." "I understand," he said, his voice firm yet pleading. "But I need to apologize, to explain. Please, just let me talk to her." After a moment that felt like an eternity, she stepped aside. "Fine, but be gentle with her. She's fragile." As he stepped into the small apartment, Robert felt a rush of emotions. The walls were adorned with modest decorations, a stark contrast to the opulence he was used to. And then he saw her, Agnes, seated in a worn armchair, her frail figure wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked older, wearier, and his heart ached at the sight. "Agnes," he began, his voice trembling with sincerity. But before he could continue, she looked away, the hurt in her eyes cutting deeper than any words could express. Robert Sinclair stood outside the modest home, a trembling mix of anticipation and dread coursing through him. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, but it did little to ease the tightness in his chest. He had finally tracked down Agnes, the woman he had callously dismissed, only to discover that she was more than just a housekeeper. She was his grandmother. The realization weighed heavily on him as he knocked on the door, each rap echoing the gravity of his intentions. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her 60s with a weary yet warm expression. Her eyes, familiar yet foreign, widened in shock. "Robert?" Agnes's voice trembled, a mixture of surprise and caution evident. "Agnes, Grandma," he stuttered, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. "I'm so sorry for everything. I need to talk to you." Agnes stepped back, her gaze darting between him and the threshold of her home, as if weighing her options. "What do you want, Robert?" she asked, her tone defensive but laced with an undercurrent of vulnerability. "I came to apologize. I had no idea about our connection," he confessed, his voice cracking slightly. "I treated you horrendously. I was arrogant and blind. Please, can we talk?" After a brief pause, she nodded, a flicker of uncertainty passing across her face. "Come in, then." Agnes led him into a modest living room adorned with family photos, a stark contrast to the opulence of his mansion. The warmth of the space wrapped around them, but the tension was palpable. They sat across from each other, and Robert studied her face, the lines of age and hardship etched deeply into her skin. "I've been reflecting on everything," he began, his heart pounding. "I never understood the sacrifice you made for our family. I was so caught up in my own world." Agnes's eyes glistened with unspoken emotions. "Robert, you were just a boy. You didn't know how much I gave up to take care of your mother. I loved her like my own. But when your father found out I was raising her alone, he shunned me. I became a secret, a shameful part of the Sinclair history. The weight of her words hit Robert like a freight train. I can't believe it. All this time, I treated you like an employee, not realizing you were family. His voice broke as regret poured out of him. I'm so sorry, Grandma. Suddenly the room felt suffocating, and Agnes turned her gaze away, a tear escaping down her cheek. There's so much pain in the past, Robert. I let go of my dreams to raise your mother. I thought I was doing the right thing, but when I was cast aside by your family, it broke me. I want to make it right, Robert pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. I want you back in my life, in our family. We can rebuild this together. Agnes shook her head, a mixture of sadness and resolve in her expression. Sometimes it's too late for rebuilding. The past has its grip on us, and I'm not sure I can bear the burden of those memories again. You have to understand, I was left with nothing. As the air thickened with emotion, Robert sensed the weight of their shared history pressing down upon them. Please, I can change. I can be better. Let me show you that I can honor your sacrifices. I can love you as family should. But Agnes's breathing grew shallow, and suddenly she clutched her chest, her face paling. Robert, she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. I can't. Agnes! He jumped to his feet, panic surging through him as she slumped back against the couch. No, please, stay with me! In that harrowing moment, Robert felt the world around him fade. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. Here was the woman he had wronged, the woman who had given up everything for his family, and now he might lose her forever. He hurried to her side, cradling her head in his arms, the weight of his arrogance crashing down. Help! Somebody! He shouted, his voice echoing through the small house, desperation coloring every syllable. But deep down, he knew that nothing could erase the wounds he had inflicted, and the lesson of empathy and respect resonated painfully, leaving him shattered as he held her frail body, grappling with the horror of what he might have done. Agnes's breaths became more labored, and in that moment, Robert understood the true cost of his ignorance.